On May 15, 2026, just over 1 month ago, 12 gunmen riding motorcycles dressed in military camouflage descended on 3 schools in a quiet cluster of communities near Ogbomoso in Oriire local government area of Oyo State. They arrived during school hours. The children were already seated at their desks. Within minutes, the attackers had abducted approximately 46 people, including a 2-year-old toddler, a school principal, 7 teachers, and dozens of pupils from Baptist Nursery and Primary School in Yawata and Community Grammar School in Ahoro Esinele. One of those teachers, Michael Oyedoku, a mathematics teacher, was beheaded in captivity, on camera. The video went viral. Now here is what nobody is asking loudly enough. How did bandits with military-grade camouflage and coordinated motorcycle formations manage to strike 3 schools simultaneously in Oyo State, the southwest, a region that was, until recently, considered Nigeria's security flaw? And more importantly, 1 month later, with a mathematics teacher's blood already spilled, with an army lieutenant killed in the rescue operation, with surveillance aircraft still being assembled in a Lagos hangar, why are the children still in the forest? That is the question VeryDarkMan and the Ratel Movement forced into the open on June 16th, when they marched through the streets of Ibadan and dragged Governor Seyi Makinde out of his Ikolaba residence to answer it face to face. Stay with me, because this story is not just about one protest, one governor, or even one abduction. It is about what happens when the Nigerian state fails its most fundamental promise and who gets to hold it accountable. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand what happened in Ibadan on June 16th, you need to understand what happened 31 days earlier in Oriire. It was a Friday morning, around 8 o'clock. 12 armed men riding 6 motorcycles entered the Esinele Ahoro community in Oriire local government area of Oyo State, a rural district on the edge of Oyo State's border with Kwara, just south of the old Oyo National Park. These men were not hiding. They communicated in Yoruba, Hausa, and Pidgin. They fired shots before storming classrooms, and then they left, with children, with teachers, and with 4 motorcycles stolen from villagers as they went. The official breakdown, as released by Governor Makinde himself: 18 children and 7 teachers from First Baptist Nursery and Primary School in Yawata, and 7 students from Community Secondary School. Total confirmed 32 abductees from the state government's count, though community leaders and other sources put the figure closer to 46, including that 2-year-old toddler, Christiana Akanbi, who was in the wrong classroom at the wrong moment. Days later, one of the abducted teachers, Michael Oyedoku, a 57-year-old mathematics teacher who had given his career to that community, was murdered in captivity, not quietly, on video. His beheading was used as a pressure tactic by his abductors. The video circulated on social media before any official statement was issued. Now that detail matters because it told every Nigerian parent watching, from Lagos Island to Kaduna, something the government had not yet admitted: the kidnappers were not afraid. Now, why is this story breaking specifically now, a month after the attack? That is a strategic question worth pausing on. The VDM protest on June 16th did not materialize from nowhere. It was the second act of a coordinated escalation sequence. The first act was Democracy Day, June 12, when protests against the Tinubu administration swept through Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Kano, Enugu, Akure, Aba, and Makurudi. In Abuja, VDM himself had led a Ratel Movement march to the Nigerian Air Force Base, chanting "Tinubu must go" and "bandits must go." Sowore was tear-gassed to close range by police. By the time June 16th arrived, the one-month anniversary of the Oriire attack, the protest energy had not dissipated, it had redirected, this time toward Ibadan, and this time toward a governor who had positioned himself as one of the Tinubu administration's most prominent PDP opposition figures, Governor Seyi Makinde. That framing, protest at a PDP governor's gate as part of a broader Tinubu must go wave, is the first thing we need to interrogate carefully. I want you to hold one question in your mind as we go deeper, because we will return to it. Is what happened in Oriire a Seyi Makinde failure, a Tinubu failure, or a systemic failure that both of them are now using each other to avoid?
Here is where the story gets constitutionally complicated, and deliberately so. Under Nigeria's 1999 constitution, internal security is primarily a federal responsibility. The Nigeria Police Force is a federal institution. The military is federal. The Department of State Services is federal. State governors do not command these forces. They request their deployment and cooperation. Seyi Makinde is the governor of Oyo State, but he does not own, command, or control the army units that must enter the old Oyo National Park to retrieve 46 abductees from heavily armed bandits in thick forest terrain. And Governor Makinde has said exactly this repeatedly, and critics have responded by calling it a constitutional excuse. Let us be precise. The constitutional framework is real, but so is the pattern of governors hiding behind it. Here is the breakdown of which institutions are directly involved and how each one has or has not functioned. The Oyo State government. Makinde moved with measurable speed on the executive actions within his control. He signed Executive Order 001 of 2026 regulating local security outfits. He signed Executive Order 002 of 2026 restricting commercial motorcycle operations, a direct response to the fact that the bandits arrived on motorcycles. He established an Operational Rescue Coordination Center at the police headquarters in Ibadan. He publicly confirmed the abduction numbers, rejected rumors of early releases, and resisted pressure to negotiate ransoms. On June 12th, he confirmed in his gubernatorial newsletter that intelligence placed the victims within the old Oyo National Park axis, still alive. What Makinde has not done is provide a timeline. He has not explained what specifically is delaying the operation 1 month in, beyond saying the terrain is difficult and that caution is necessary to avoid civilian casualties. His phrase, "Oyo is not Chibok," was emotionally powerful, but it is also a promissory note that is now 31 days overdue. The federal government. President Tinubu deployed a specialized rescue team to Oyo. He approved 1,000 forest guards. He publicly vowed the victims would be rescued. His security apparatus, military, air force, intelligence, has been present in the state since the attack. But here is the accountability gap. There has been no federal press briefing on the specific state of rescue operations, no Joint Operations Command update, no named commanding officer to question. The federal response has been visible in press releases and invisible in outcomes. The Nigeria Army. On June 16th, the same day VDM was marching in Ibadan, Governor Makinde disclosed that a Nigerian Army lieutenant had been killed during the rescue operation. This is a significant admission. It confirms that active incursions into the kidnappers' position have taken place. It also confirms that those incursions have not yet succeeded. The Army has not publicly confirmed this casualty or provided any operational update. The Oyo State Judiciary and Civil Society. Something worth noting. The Nigeria Union of Teachers declared an indefinite strike following the attack. NANS, the NLC, and civil society groups converged on the government house even before VDM arrived. This was not a protest manufactured by one influencer. It was civic pressure that had been building for weeks, and VDM functioned as an accelerant, not an originator. Now, where is the deliberate ambiguity and who benefits from it? The ambiguity is in the division of security command. When things go wrong, the governor says the military is federal. The federal government says the governor has primary responsibility for community policing and intelligence. Both of these things can be constitutionally true and operationally useless at the same time. The families in Oriire do not have a constitutional court to argue their children back from the forest. They have waiting. And after 31 days, waiting is what the system has given them. Now, pause for a second. A 2-year-old in a classroom on a Friday morning in Oyo State, the same Oyo State that hosted the 1977 Festac, the same Southwest that positioned itself for decades as Nigeria's most stable geopolitical zone. This is not happening in a vacuum. Something has shifted in the security landscape of Nigeria's south, and we need to name what it is. This is the section most Nigerian political commentators will avoid because it requires you to hold two uncomfortable truths. Truth 1. VDM's Ibadan protest was at its core a genuine civic response to a genuine security failure. 46 people, including children, have been held in a forest for over a month. A teacher was beheaded. Another, this time in uniform, a lieutenant in the Nigerian army, has now been killed in the rescue attempt. Any Nigerian with a functioning conscience should be demanding answers. Truth 2. The Tinubu must go protest wave in which this Ibadan march is embedded is not politically neutral. It is part of a coordinated escalation strategy by opposition-aligned civil society and activist networks aimed at building momentum toward the 2027 general election. That does not make the grievances illegitimate, but it does mean that political actors on all sides are using these grievances for strategic positioning, and viewers deserve to know who gains what. Let us map the chessboard. Seyi Makinde is in the most exposed position. He is the sitting governor of Oyo State, which means the primary accountability for the security environment belongs partly to him. But he is also the man widely regarded as the leading opposition presidential aspirant ahead of 2027, affirmed as the Allied People's Movement's preferred candidate as recently as May 30, 2026. A prolonged, unresolved abduction crisis under his watch undermines the very narrative he needs to run on, that he is a competent executive, a contrast to the Tinubu administration. Former Governor Oyo State of Ekiti State took this further and poisonously by publicly alleging on Channels TV that the Oyo abduction was orchestrated by Makinde to embarrass President Tinubu ahead of 2027. Makinde called that precisely what it was, a political mischief in a moment of national pain. Bola Tinubu faces a different kind of exposure. The Democracy Day protests were not a fringe event. They swept through at least 9 major cities. The Tinubu Must Go slogan, chanted from Abuja to Port Harcourt, carries the Oriire abduction as one of its primary justifications. The president can point to federal deployments and rescue commitments, but every day the children remain in that forest is a day the opposition has a live exhibit of governance failure to present to the electorate. Tinubu's approval of 1,000 forest guards was significant, but it is a medium-term structural measure, not a rescue operation. The two things should not be conflated. VDM gains regardless of outcome. If the children are released, he led the march that kept the pressure on. If they are not, he remains the voice that refused to be silent. His Ratel Movement has now staged major protests in Abuja and Ibadan within 5 days of each other, establishing national reach. He was tear-gassed on Democracy Day in Abuja. He was received by the governor of Oyo State within 24 hours of arriving in Ibadan. That is a remarkable institutional footprint for a citizen activist who 1 year ago was primarily known as a social media commentator. The Arewa youth establishment made its calculation visible when the Arewa youth president, Yerima Shettima, publicly warned VDM to take his protests back to Edo State, accusing him of disrespecting northerners by staging demonstrations in the north. What Shettima's reaction reveals is that the protest wave has registered as a political threat to APC-aligned northern interests ahead of 2027. That reaction, essentially asking a citizen to confine his civic voice to his ethnic geography, tells you more about Nigeria's political fault lines than it does about VDM. Who is conspicuously silent? Watch the governors of APC-controlled southwest states, Dapo Abiodun of Ogun State, Babajide Sanwo-Olu of Lagos State, and Biodun Oyebanji of Ekiti State. They have offered varying degrees of condolence and solidarity on the Oriire abduction, but none of them has called for the kind of federal accountability that the scale of this crisis demands. Their silence is tactical. The Southwest Governor conversation on Tinubu is one that, for now, happens behind closed doors. Here is the question that connects everything we've discussed so far to what's coming next. Is the banditry that descended on Oriire LGA on May 15th a random criminal event, or is it the southward migration of an insurgency that both Abuja and Ibadan have refused to name? We'll get into that, but first, the national implications. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything.
Here is where we resolve the first open loop. Is this a Makinde failure, a Tinubu failure, or a systemic failure that both are using each other to avoid? The honest answer is all three, but not equally, and the weights matter. The primary institutional failure here is federal. Internal security in Nigeria, the power to mobilize armed forces, deploy intelligence networks, coordinate multi-state operations against non-state armed groups belongs to the federal government. Seyi Makinde can sign executive orders about Okada operations. He cannot send a battalion into Old Oyo National Park without federal authorization and military command. He can, and did, commit to doing everything within his constitutional lane. Whether that was enough leadership or whether it was institutional cover-seeking is a genuine debate. But the argument that this is primarily a state failure ignores the architecture of Nigerian security governance. What this crisis does expose at the state level is the intelligence vacuum. 12 armed men rode into Oriire in military camouflage on 6 motorcycles and executed a coordinated multi-site abduction during school hours. The Oyo State government intelligence apparatus, whatever it is, did not see this coming. The Old Oyo National Park, which borders Oyo State's rural north, has been flagged as a bandit corridor for years. The abduction of 4 passengers on the Igbeti-Kishi Road in March 2026, just 2 months before, was a warning signal. It was not acted on with the urgency it deserved. Now, the broader national picture. The Oriire attack is not an isolated incident. It is part of a documented pattern of southward bandit migration. Between 2024 and 2026, over 100 children were abducted from a Catholic school in Naija State. The Zamfara, Kaduna, and Katsina kidnapping templates, mass abductions of school children followed by ransom demands or executions, have now crossed the Niger River and established presence in the Middle Belt and the Southwest Corridor. Between 1,600 and 1,700 Nigerian school children have been abducted directly from schools since 2014. Over 180 have been killed. The Chibok girls whom Governor Makinde invoked, many of them are still missing 12 years later. That is the trajectory he is promising Oyo will not follow. That is the bar he has set for himself. For ordinary Nigerians, the people furthest from the levers of power, the Oriire abduction has produced a chilling secondary effect that the political conversation is not fully capturing. Teachers are refusing to go to school. The Nigerian Union of Teachers declared an indefinite strike following the attack. Across Oyo State's rural communities, classrooms are empty not because children have been taken, but because the adults responsible for them no longer feel safe. The erosion of the teacher-student relationship as a point of trust in rural Nigeria is a long-term education crisis unfolding beneath the surface of the security headlines. Think about what it means practically, materially, for a primary school teacher in Oriire LGA to show up to work the morning after Michael Oyedokun's beheading was circulated on WhatsApp. That is not an abstraction. That is a human being weighing their paycheck against their life. And the state that employs that teacher has not given them a compelling enough reason to stay. What makes the Oriire abduction internationally significant is not its scale. Tragically, Nigeria has seen worse. What makes it significant is its geography. For the better part of Nigeria's post-Chibok decade, the global narrative around Nigerian insecurity was a northern story. Boko Haram in the northeast, banditry in the northwest, farmer-herder conflict in the Middle Belt. International development partners, foreign investors, and diaspora remittance decisions were calibrated around that geography. The southwest, anchored by Lagos, Ibadan, and the commercial corridor, was the risk-adjusted safe zone. The Oriire attack breaks that calculus. Investors with exposure to Oyo State, to the broader southwest corridor, to the agricultural and manufacturing sectors that rely on rural stability are now asking questions they were not asking 6 months ago. The perception of the southwest as a security flaw has shifted. That shift will not show up immediately in capital flight data, but it will show up in insurance premiums, in foreign investor due diligence reports, and in the risk appetite calculations of multinationals weighing southwest Nigerian operations. For the diaspora, particularly Yoruba Nigerians in the UK, US, Canada, and South Africa, this crisis carries a specific cultural weight. The Ibadan of the protest on June 16th is not just a political geography, it is the home city of millions of Nigerians in the diaspora who are watching, sending money, and making decisions about whether or when to return. When VDM marched through Ibadan demanding answers about abducted children, he was also speaking for every Nigerian parent living abroad who thought, "Not my Southwest, not my home." ECOWAS and the African Union have not formally commented on the Oriire abduction, and that silence is itself telling. The AU's Silencing the Guns initiative, which set a 2020 deadline for ending armed conflicts on the continent, operates at a level of diplomatic abstraction that provides no accountability for a mathematics teacher beheaded in a forest in Oyo State. Until continental bodies develop mechanisms for naming and sanctioning subnational armed groups that cross state boundaries, they will remain structurally irrelevant to crises like this one. Let us resolve the second open loop and steelman the opposing view, because it deserves a fair hearing. The strongest argument in defense of Governor Makinde, and by extension the Nigerian state's measured response, goes like this. Rescue operations involving children require extraordinary caution. The military has confirmed the victims are alive and still in the park. An aggressive incursion risks mass executions. The experience of Chibok shows that brute force response is not always the right response. Makinde is holding a line between public pressure and tactical restraint, and he should be given space to do so. That is not a weak argument. It is the argument that any experienced crisis negotiator, any military commander with hostage rescue experience would endorse. The governor confirmed that a Nigerian army lieutenant has already been killed in rescue attempts. This operation is not costless. The caution is real. But here is where it breaks down. Tactical restraint and institutional accountability are not the same thing. The governor can be tactically cautious while simultaneously providing the public with more information about what is being done, on what timeline, with what benchmarks for escalation or negotiation. He has not done that. What the public has received is a series of emotional assurances, "I will risk my life for them," "Oyo is not Chibok," without a single operational milestone. Now, the misconceptions circulating on social media that need correcting. Misconception 1. Makinde allowed this to happen because Oriire is not his political stronghold. Oriire LGA did not deliver a majority for Makinde in recent elections. That much is accurate. But there's zero credible evidence that the governor deliberately withheld security resources from the area for political reasons. Former Governor Fayose's claim that Makinde orchestrated the kidnapping was irresponsible. Criticizing Makinde's response is legitimate. Criminalizing it without evidence is not. Misconception 2. This is a Fulani problem. The attackers communicated in Yoruba, Hausa, and Pidgin. The ethnic composition of the bandit group has not been established by any official investigation. Attributing this to a single ethnic group without evidence is not analysis. It is a template being imposed on an ambiguous event. It also risks generating retaliatory violence against innocent Yoruba, Hausa, or Fulani communities that had nothing to do with this attack. Misconception 3. VDM meeting with Makinde means the protest succeeded. It does not. A meeting without outcomes is a photo opportunity. The test of the protest's success will be whether the children come home. Here is the uncomfortable reframe. VDM did something the Nigerian state has largely failed to do. He treated this abduction as a national emergency rather than a regional inconvenience. The question is whether the institutions he pressured will now match his urgency with results or just outlast it.
3 most likely next moves from key actors. Makinde. The governor will attempt a phased narrative management. In the short term, expect continued assurances, possible low-profile releases of a small number of victims to demonstrate progress without triggering full media attention. The 2 surveillance aircraft he purchased are scheduled to be operational by end of June 2026. Their deployment will be publicized as a decisive escalation of the rescue effort. Whether that produces results or functions primarily as a political performance depends on the intelligence already gathered. The federal government. Tinubu will attempt to separate the Oriire story from the broader Tinubu must go protest wave. Expect federal messaging that frames the security response as evidence of his government's responsiveness, while distancing from accountability for the underlying failure that allowed the attack to happen. Watch for a possible federal security summit or Oyo specific security strategy announcement before the end of July. VDM and the Ratel Movement. Having staged consecutive major demonstrations, Abuja on June 11-12 and Ibadan on June 16, the pressure on VDM is to demonstrate sustained impact rather than episodic energy. If the children are not released within the next 2 to 3 weeks, expect another escalation, possibly a return to Abuja, possibly targeting the Defense Ministry or the Presidency directly. The movement has credibility as long as it maintains non-violence and clear, measurable demands. The moment it drifts toward vigilante framing, as VDM's offer to go into the bushes with security forces suggested, it creates legal and moral exposure that the state will use to delegitimize it. What signals should you watch? Watch the teachers' strike. If the NUT lifts the strike, it signals either genuine rescue progress or a negotiated silence. If it holds through July, it signals that frontline workers have lost faith in both the state and federal governments. Watch the old Oyo National Park intelligence disclosures. Makinde said on June 12 that the victims are within that axis. If there is no further official intelligence update by end of June, the cover of ongoing operations will begin to look like information management. Watch whether the political opposition, particularly Peter Obi's NDC and the broader PDP bloc, formally adopts the Oriire crisis as an electoral accountability framework for 2027. So far, the criticism has come primarily from civil society and activist networks. The moment it migrates into formal political parties, the framing of the crisis will shift from security to electoral. Under what conditions does this escalate? If a second victim is killed in captivity, if the teachers' strike triggers a mass school dropout crisis in rural Oyo, if VDM or any protest leader is arrested. Under what conditions does it de-escalate? If even a partial rescue, 10, 15 victims returned alive, is confirmed and publicly verified, that single event would dramatically reduce the political temperature. The 12-month political impact if the current trajectory holds. Makinde's 2027 presidential aspirations absorb significant damage, not fatal, but real. Tinubu's security narrative, never his strongest suit, becomes the central referendum of the election cycle. And the southward migration of banditry becomes the defining security story of the next election, for the first time pulling the southwest electorate out of its comfort zone and into the national security conversation. We opened with a question: why are the children still in the forest? Here is the honest, unflinching answer. Because the Nigerian state, federal and state, has not yet decided that the political cost of failure is higher than the operational cost of success. That sounds harsh, but consider the evidence. Makinde signed 2 executive orders within weeks of the attack. He committed his surveillance aircraft. He told the protesters and the nation that he would risk his life for those children. Tinubu deployed a specialized rescue team, approved 1,000 forest guards, and issued a public vow of rescue. Both men have done what presidents and governors do when a crisis becomes politically visible. They have performed urgency. What they have not done, together, is demonstrate the kind of coordinated, publicly accountable, operationally transparent response that matches the scale of what has been taken from those families. VDM did not drag Makinde out of his office to embarrass him. He dragged him out to remind him and us that 46 people, including a 2-year-old, are still in a forest, and that the people responsible for getting them out have been in their offices issuing newsletters and press statements for 31 days. That is not analysis dressed as sentiment. That is the ledger in plain view. The unresolved thread, the one I want you to carry into the next conversation, is this. The old Oyo National Park is a vast federal forest reserve that has now been used as a bandit corridor for at least 2 major abduction incidents. When this crisis is over, however it ends, there will need to be a serious, uncomfortable conversation about Nigeria's ungoverned forest spaces, about the intelligence architecture that is supposed to monitor them, and about who owns the failure when armed men can ride 6 motorcycles into a primary school and ride out with a 2-year-old. That conversation has not started, and that is the story we will return to. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.